talking with Brent Ciurlino, the Chief Operating and Risk Officer for Velocity SBA, one of the top SBLC SBA 7A lenders out there. Brent, thank you so much for joining A Coleman Conversation. You and I go way back. You were asking me before this, hey, what are we talking about? And am I talking about Brent's journey? And I said, absolutely. But one of the things I want to focus on is you are one of the few in our industry that have a macro understanding of SBA 7A lending. Most of us are just on the day-to-day, but you've made a career out of assessing risk, but more importantly, on a political macro basis, how important this program is for Main Street. So let's start there. Let's start at the top, the right. 30,000 foot.
Well, and I'll take a little bit of a backward journey. So for the people listening, I've worked for almost every president since Bush 1. So Bush 1 is when I got appointed to be deputy director for the FDIC, which then parlayed me into working with the World Bank under the Clinton administration, which then when the financial crisis hit with Bush 2, I was overseas and I got called back to work with Bush 2 initially, and then carried over into an appointment with the Obamas, both at FDIC and SBA, and that's how I fell into SBA. Now, I tell that story a little bit because when I went overseas, I was all over, from Russia to Azerbaijan to Indonesia to Peru, Ecuador, Nicaragua, a lot of places, fixing crises, Mexico, where they had peso crisis with the Clinton administration. What was interesting is I wound up in the East English-speaking Caribbean, and a lot of folks during that period were trying to figure out how to incentivize banks to make business loans, because every economy, no matter how big or small, whether it's higglers, which the Caribbean calls, which are merchants, to agriculture, which drives, in most of those countries, 50% of their business is agricultural related or mining. There is always this, what's a good way to provide some form of government incentive along with the lenders through the central bank or Ministry of Finance. And I fell into that when I started to go overseas. SBA wasn't a big deal during the S&L crisis, right? But of course, businesses were impacted based on S&L activity, but it was more in the real estate development, all the normal things you'd think about with an S&L situation and home loans. But as I went overseas, it was really business oriented. But I was a little bit uncertain because I became the president and CEO of about a $2 billion international bank out of the Caribbean, with offices in the U.S., England, all the English-speaking Caribbean, and Canada. And the Brits were trying, and their bank system affiliates were trying to provide a government guarantee, but they had no secondary market. So lo and behold, I'm trying to do those kinds of things to re-stimulate during the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And, there was, a number of there was a tech bubble, then there was, 9/11. So a lot of impacts there that were particularly affecting outside of the country as well as in our country. But, when we get a cold, the rest of the world, they get the flu. So
pneumonia. Yeah.
Now, yes. So lo and behold, I wind up in late 2008 and 2009 being called back to the FDIC and being stationed as one of the corporate directors for the FDIC West Coast, which was in Irvine. And that I got in there literally Easter Sunday of 2009, and a few months later, I was asked to take over Temecula Valley Bank, which was one of the largest SBA lenders.
I did not know that. I did not know that.
And I was one of the there's actually another fellow that was the receiver, but I was the asset manager.
I didn't know that.
And I was the corporate director of asset marketing, which means I'm the one that I organized all of the takeovers every Saturday and every Friday night.
Friday nights.
For the whole Western United States for 3 years. So I fell into the SBA bit. So I wound up having to talk to the subject matter expert in Dallas on SBA. And that fella became kind of him, and he was going to retire after the crisis. So they started, I guess, bringing me on because of all the SBA lending that was going on in California, because it's always been, if not the biggest market, one of the biggest markets, whether it's 7A or 504. And of course, Temecula Valley was one of the biggest, right? And as we managed that office through the crisis to the end of 2011, there was a sunset on that office. I got a call from Dallas and Washington, D.C. The FDIC wanted to send me back to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico. And it's like, I did my duty in the Caribbean. I got a wife out of the deal. And I figured I'd stay on top. That was a good win. Not only did I learn a lot about offshore banking, but I got a great wife out of the deal. I said, I don't want to go back to the Caribbean, although I love it. And I don't want to move to Jacksonville. My wife and I'd like to go to Washington, D.C. They went quiet for about 10 days, and then I get a call back that Gene Hewlett, Karen Mills, and Steve, he's at Live Oak, one of their chief credit officers. They were recruiting. They needed someone to come take over Oakram because there was a lot of challenges, and FDIC asked if I'd go back to Washington, D.C. to work with SBA to be the director of Oakram. And then I started an interview process. Steve Smits, excuse me, Steve.
Very good. Yeah.
Right. And he was close with Patrick, Kelly. They were all part of the Karen Mills crew. And that's how I wound up back at SBA. So I literally fell into it. And I say to young people, you never know where you're going to end up, and you are where you're supposed to be, I guess. So
well, I have so many follow-up questions. So the first one is, I got to see your passport.
Well, there's 3 of them because I ran out of pages.
I love the journey, and I love the description. And please, you need to emphasize the great relationship you forged with Jamaica, and good for you.
Well, say another thing. I don't know if you remember Jim Hammersley, but
of course.
So Jim, when he retired, went to the World Bank. He also asked me when I left SBA if I would do some things, but I actually turned him on to the folks at the Jamaica Development Bank, and he's been all over the world bringing the message of SBA, or SBA-like to other countries. So when I started to serve as director of Oakram, I visited with more than 22 to 25 countries that came in to look at our program. It's desired all over the world. And it's just been amazing. I think a number of folks have worked alongside Jim or have been to places like Egypt, Japan, Indonesia, Ireland, England, the Caribbean, in multiple countries in the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean, and all that. So really the biggest element of SBA, and I may lean a little bit on some things Barry Sloan said in his deal, is this is a fantastically brilliant program, and it has features that unfortunately can't be duplicated, or other governments can't get their head around the secondary market aspect, because it's easy to give a guarantee, it's easy to make an interest spread, but it's also, it's first loss. In other countries, it's first loss kind of, instead of how we have a pari passu, and we're able to make if you choose, you're able to make secondary market fee income in our country. So it's being studied by everybody. I think people need to realize He also made another comment that we're moving from a consumption under this administration, a consumption state of mind, to an investment state of mind. And that's what other countries are trying to figure out. How do they, because if you don't have this kind of a program to offer to entrepreneurs and it makes money, if it's run correctly, it makes money for the government.
Well, what I love in you describing what you've done is you have such a great macroeconomic background. You were new to SBA. You quickly seized on what the advantages are for SBA. We can sell these loans to a secondary market that have the government rating behind it. So with that unique background, you're put into a position of Office of Risk Management with that background. So what you immediately focused on, this is a great program. What can I, Brent Ciurlino, do to make sure that we keep the trains running on time and we make it better? What was your mindset?
There's two things I did, and I went. My initial career was with the Farm Credit Bank System, who also had experienced a crisis in the late 80s, early 90s. And I worked overseas where the monitoring of banks is more of a surveillance program. And I don't mean surveillance like spy surveillance. I mean monitoring and surveillance by metrics. So John White, who was serving as the deputy director at SBA, introduced me to the lender loan monitoring system, and I realized that the banks and lenders were paying for that. And I realized this whole trove of data, and I said, well, this to me let's explore this with S&P, or excuse me, Dun & Bradstreet, and Steve Kucharski and his team, and say, this is really where we can see. I don't necessarily trust the OMB budget model. Let's look at what really happens, and let's set this up like a dial, where you dial into the frequency. And if we have all this data for the last decade, and we keep doing it for another decade, we can build the Paris and Smart system around the two and gauge it so that you can adjust it so you know whether the program is in the red or in the black. Okay. And then use that, since the banks are paying for this in LLMS, let's give them something that's worthwhile to use as a risk management tool. So we came up with the parameters of, the 15 items, so you can kind of see. Now, there's some flaws in it, and then it's time lagged, right? So new loans don't necessarily affect it. So you are a little bit of a lag, but you are creating flags and you're giving data back that can be used in your data pack. And so I thought that would be something, if it could sustain, would change the nature of SBA's approach to oversight, and also give some people that are lending in the industry at least a tool for their money. If you're paying for this.
Right.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Brent, I've said entrepreneurs are a whole lot smarter than they were 20 years ago with access to the internet and being able to survive economic challenges and crises. I don't think I've asked you this, but you've had a perspective now in the SBA portfolio since Temecula Valley days. So we're talking 15 plus years. Tell me about the overall portfolio. Is it better than it was today than 2000?
Well, it's way better.
Go ahead.
It's way better than it was. When I inherited it, it was very distressed.
Okay.
We had just come out of the
recession.
The recession, and what I observed is, and I was overseas, so when I came back, I was learning again what had happened over the last few years. And you had certain large banks, Banco Popular, B of A, some others that went into this express program and started making $100,000, I call them heartbeat loans, and they weren't panning out. There's a few lenders, particularly SBLCs, that were trying to use their own scoring model. There was no validation, so there was no correlation. So all of a sudden, a lot of loans started to default that were semi-unsecured. And then, of course, you had the deterioration in collateral values due to the real estate situation for those few years. So you came in to, a portfolio at that time. It was around, I think, $40 billion for the 7A and a little under 20 billion for the 504, and we probably had 10 billion to 12 billion in distressed or stressed loans. Right. And then we had some lenders that, simply weren't, they should be out of business, so now we're at 200 billion, right? We also went from $2.5 million to a $5 million loan. But as we came out of the recession, there was upside. So as we got into 2012, by the time I got there, there was some cleanup necessary, but a lot of the stress impact. So I saw that, through Karen Mills, Gene Hewlett, the team, and Diana Seaborn, but was over in OFA, start to design the program so it would grow and pay for itself and repay, some of the distress cost. And I was, it's been a really good, and get new lenders in, get old lenders out that were insolvent or just couldn't bear it, and get new lenders in, like a Barry who was in, but he was able to now. Same with Harvest, same with Crossroads. Our guys we were originally Crossroads, now Velocity. Same with ReadyCap. So and new lenders came in and saw the benefit of the program.
Absolutely. And with that database model, SBA can monitor the lenders, and now they have new enforcement actions that. And
look at what you've done. You and some others have that data became transparent, which now you can provide to lenders and or users, and all of a sudden, I wish we'd get back to more transparency. There was a set of transparencies when we were there. When I was able to change over the Paris and Smart, then we kind of seemed like the transparency somewhat got kind of foggy, and maybe we'll get back to some more transparency because we, listen, the 7A program, we're 25%, participant partners. So what's the secret in the data? Like, why should the data be secret, right?
You and I are in the same wavelength on it, absolutely. You were talking about dialing the risk factor. The Trump administration a couple months ago said, hey, we think that the portfolio is getting a little distressed. We're going to do the dial. We're going to add back some fees or whatever. This isn't a political question. It's a risk management question. Did it work? Did the model work?
The new one?
Yeah.
I think it's heading in the right direction.
Good.
I call that a risk tolerance dial, right? What I do think it sends a signal that this administration supports this program.
Right.
And saying, hey, you guys have proven that you can make money. You've proven you can pay back when there's a distress, just like FDIC has proven. Whether people want to complain about, methodology or whatever, the bottom line is we made money to pay back to Treasury. FDIC also has made money to pay back for its, subsidy, whatever was happening to help the deposit insurance fund. So it's proven rather than coming in and saying, I'm going to do away with the program, I'm going to merge it into the Commerce Department and all kinds of other things that have been talked about in other Republican administrations, per se. And they really said, no, let's look at this. It's got a proven track record. There's metrics we can use. The subcommittees, which I've talked to a lot, both on the record and, in private sessions, understand the Paris and Smart and the data that's there. And so does Nagel. Kristen Grancelli has been a very big supporter or constructive supporter, for me and for others at Okram back in the day when she was on the Hill herself, working with the committees. So I think that meant a lot, and I think it went a long way towards, and now you have an entrepreneur again, like a Karen Mills, but with Kelly Loeffler, who's another entrepreneur who understands it. They're not really in it for the political aspects. They're in it because it's a program that helps business people, as you say, Main Street.
So now you've changed your emphasis from the big picture, from working with the lenders. We're saying, here's the model. Let's stick to this. This is a great program, 100% behind it. Now you're working with a lender. You're working with Velocity. Tell us about Velocity and what you specifically do for them.
Well, first of all, I worked with a lot of the SBLCs, as you know. And if anybody, goes to my LinkedIn, it's like I look like I skipped around, but I wasn't real, I really needed to earn my way into the SBA space. It's easy being at the, point your finger at oversight, but then you had to get in the weeds and see how different groups approach actually making loans. And there's special legislation to create SBLCs, and that seemed to be a place that needed the most help. And it was definitely a place where we had percentage-wise, 50% of the SBLCs went out of bit. There's license transfer, ownership transfers. And, that's also, it's harder to penetrate into a bank organization because of all of the, bureaucracy within a bank and such. So I wanted to see how it really worked. And I was lucky enough to work with some of the best folks out there, whether they have defaults or challenges. The bottom line is this is not an easy business on the non-bank side. And then I really enjoyed Velocity because I sold them their license when I was there. It used to be the Superior Financial license that was in San Francisco. And so a lot of people don't realize our affiliated, I'll call them parent per se, is Velocity Vehicle Group, which is two gentlemen that started. They're now a multi-billion-dollar company. They are a transportation company. They're the largest Freightliner dealers in the world.
I did not know that.
They have, facilities here in the United States, Australia, Mexico, Canada. But they were two fellas that started lending in the CalCap program, which I think you're familiar with, the California Capital Access Program. Particularly in the area of emission control conversions. And they started seeing this, what I'll call SBA lookalike, back in the, around 2011, 12, 13. And then somehow they crossed paths with, I think it was Mark, who was running Superior, and they wound up deciding they wanted to buy this SBA license because they do a lot of lending to fleets, whether it's bakeries, delivery companies, they're seeing a lot of small businesses. So they brought that in. And they also have an affiliate lending group called Crossroads Equipment Finance, which is a very large truck finance group and leasing group for trucks and trailers. So yes, we're over here as an independent affiliate, as an SBLC, but these fellas are they think like Berkshire Hathaway. So the other SBLCs that I was observing were, publicly traded. They all, they're facing the same things that a publicly traded bank faces, or whatever, this quarterly thing. And when I had the chance for Charles Rowe asked me to finally join, I was advising them. I chose them because they had patient capital. And they aren't, yes, there's performance metrics, but they're not living quarter to quarter to pump, as Hans and Franz would say, to pump you up.
Right.
They're trying to really help small business from an individual truck sale to a fleet sale to providing lease and finance to small business. And they're really solid folks.
So they're in California. Where do you live?
Where do I live?
Yes.
I'm in Dallas, and we have two offices. The main office for like Velocity and Crossroads is Rancho Cucamonga, LA area. And then we have an office in Orange County, in Santa Ana, and a operations office in Pasadena. And then we have our Eastern hub, I'll call it, is here in Dallas.
So why did you settle in Dallas?
Well, Charles wanted to go national, so he had pretty much built what good SBLCs do is when they start up is they take 4 years or so and put a solid, 150 million on the books. So they stayed in the West Coast-ish area there. And then as we came out of COVID, Charles wanted to expand nationally, and so did Crossroads. So the two companies together decided to set up an office in Dallas. I had lived in Dallas earlier in my career for 10 years before I went overseas. So I was able to, this was a desired place. I was looking to get out of the East Coast after COVID because I was between Washington, D.C. and North Jersey, New York. I was traveling up to Long Island, to New Tech right before COVID. And then I was asked to take a bank public during COVID in North Jersey. So I was living in North Jersey, and then finally it was like time to get out of the East and get somewhere that's more tax friendly.
And how does the Jamaican gal like Dallas?
My wife loves Dallas.
Oh, very good.
Believe it or not, it's extremely diverse here in Irving, Texas, and the whole state is an entrepreneurial, just gold mine. It's just there's stuff happening from north to south. From here going north up to Oklahoma, from here going down to Austin, and of course Austin is San Antonio, over to Houston. So it's it's really good for me because I'm meeting all these other entrepreneurs. The other thing I would say, and I think other folks in the SBA space are seeing it, is we're facing a generational changeover at the moment, or at least aspects of it with baby boomers. And so you see a lot of folks wanting to sell their business. So on the business acquisition side, you've got, 50, 60-year-olds, let's say, or so, either wanting to turn it over to their kids or they're ready to retire. They've been doing their business for 10 or 20 years. And now you've got, 30 and 40-year-olds that want to do back business acquisitions. That's happening here in Texas. Then you got, the baby boomer guys like myself, or, I'll retire and maybe I want to buy a franchise with my wife. So you got franchise stuff happening, or get into start some other little business that's not as, you built one up, you made some money, now you want to start something else maybe, or support your kids. Like I want to, support my son. My son has a business. I can put in some equity, and I can be a guarantor and help my son or son-in-law or daughter-in-law or daughter or whatever. There's as many women as men. There's as many, I'm a first generation immigrant, Italian. So there's plenty of immigrants in this area. And they're, 100% entrepreneurs, just like my family was.
Brent, I love this conversation. Your passion for what you do just oozes through the screen, and I love that you hit on the first immigrant story. I mean, that's what SBA lending is geared for that type of demographics. So I'm just I appreciate you coming on. Let me ask you this before we close. Sure. What advice, you mentioned a lot of names, which a lot of great people, a lot of great professionals, which you and I have known over the years. For the younger new generation of SBA lenders, those 30 and 40-year-old crowd that are now assuming the mantle of leadership, from your perch, what advice would you give them?
I think one thing would be, a number of successful groups are out there in the pub, like someone like a New Tech, if you wanted to read, they have public, they produce public information because they're publicly traded. It'd be interesting to read the history. I think, Tony Robbins always says, read about, how did somebody get to where they got to?
Right.
Face your fear, right? Because normally you try to face your fear. And I also think that we need to realign our knowledge of credit. I think some credit, the more you know credit, the more you'll understand how to help the borrowers and understand and navigate the risks that they may not anticipate, particularly in in either a changeover or a startup. But there's really go out there and pull data and pull about the lenders that are out there that you can read about, just because then it gives you a platform to understand how do people get to where they got to, and then what's out there with technology. We're in a state now where AI. It's like I still have to do stuff on a piece of paper, right? I still got to. Sometimes I got to compartmentalize. So don't throw out old school because there's new school. Always be aware of the old school. And that's what I think I'm still hanging around because I got something to offer, because I've gone through, when I was first underwriting, I had one of those, 20 column pads, and I had to plot everything by hand. This is before like even Lotus, and Excel was way in the future. So I just think fundamentals, it's just like of sports.
Brent, I started my banking career before computers. I was a teller. I started as a teller. And if you want to go old school, I had something called an in and out sheet.
Right.
Where the money would come in and it would go out, and you keep track.
So that's a broad question that you're asking, because I can give a lot of advice. The other one I'll say is don't ever judge a book by its cover, right? You don't know who's going to walk in your office, where they're from, and your job is to try to help figure out, because we all every day want to say yes. Okay. I have this saying, if I was a surfer, or I'm a skier, that's my biggest passion. Nice. I don't avoid a hard ski run. Okay. So if I'm going to put the word risk officer, that means I should be able to ski the risk. Okay.
I love it.
So I don't go in there every day saying my job as a risk officer is to say no first. And then my job is to say, I understand, the terrain, and let's look at the top of the run and figure out how we're going to pick our way through to get to the bottom. But that's why we're in the risk business, because we are comfortable with risk. Okay. So how do we ski it?
Yeah, great advice, and I love the skiing analogy. That is a nice analogy. Don't be afraid of the risk.
Right, but strategically pick how you're going to go down the run.
Right.
But that's what we do. That's why the program is here. It's here to create risk abatement, and that's, you can listen to a lot of folks about. That's why it's the SBA program, is because someone wiser than us realized that this would be a fabulously brilliant program if we could figure out risk abatement to induce the lenders to get involved. And they've done a masterful job through the years. And it's folks before us that postured us to be here. The Jim Hammersley for the secondary market, other folks, the John Whites that were there for many years, who came up with LLMS. There's all kind of people behind the scenes. The Steve Kacharskis with E-Tran, the John Millers for, process and guaranteed purchase centers. And, all the folks, there's some that are still there. The Vanessa Picones, who's been dealing with, guaranteed purchase insuring claims. There's all kind of people that are behind the scenes that don't get the credit for creating this program that is the envy of everybody in the world.
Now throw a name out, Charles Weatherly from the 80s. Remember that name?
Yes. I don't know him real well, though.
Yeah, neither do I, but someone was asking me who was very influential SBA. That name pops up because he was instrumental in creating the secondary market. Right. Without the secondary market, we would not have great careers for SBA lenders, great capital for borrowers, and a great program that pays for itself. So, it's, as you said, we're the envy of the world. Last question. I appreciate your comments about you sticking around in your you're not quite there. I'm going to say twilight years, but you've been giving back. What do you do? Let's finish up with personally. How do you give back personally?
Well, I try to, first of all, I am involved with the local Irving School Foundation stuff. I'm a Boy Scout. I'm a church-going fella, so I try to help youth. I still keep my finger with my wife in helping school computer programs in Jamaica.
Really? Good for you.
Teens for Technology, and I'm the social chairman of the sports club here. So I just
Brent is stumbling because, believe it or not, he's a little humble, and I know but I asked that question because Brent, you do a great job. What you do professionally, I know you also do personally. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But
also, Richard Branson has an entrepreneurial center in Montego Bay, and I'm on the advisor, consultant to the Branson Entrepreneurial Center. And Jim Hammersley got me on to the World Bank consulting list, and I've been to probably 8 countries to talk to them about implementing small business, around, how they're going to approach it, and, dealing with the politics, because, it always interfaces with politics, so. Anyway,
Brent, I appreciate you stopping by for a Coleman Conversation. I enjoyed it. I thank you very much.
You're welcome. I hope somebody found something useful out of the whole.
Trust me, they will. They will.